My name's Henry McGhie. I'm a museum consultant based in the UK. I'll not say too much about myself because I want to get straight to the work, really. So this is, as Inga says, the second in this series of seven webinars. And for this one, I'll be talking about, well, how does curation relate to the Sustainable Development Goals and their targets? And curation is one of these slightly mysterious museum words. It means very different things in different places. It can sound like people sort of organizing nice things and spending a lot of nice time, but what I'm going to try and get across today is it's really a very, very fundamental part of museum work and also a very fundamental part of society. So what are we going to cover today? Well, going to hopefully cover something like, well, what is curating and how does it relate to human rights? And how can curating help protect cultural and natural heritage? And how does it relate to sustainable development, both locally and globally? And the bigger question over all of this is how can museums, collections and exhibitions support people to meet the challenges of today and to help more people live lives where their rights are achieved? And so it's based on this, partly based on this guide that I wrote last year, which I wrote basically to try to help museums get started with the Sustainable Development Goals, because they can seem a bit complicated and a bit hard to get into. But once you get into them, they are an absolutely amazing opportunity and blueprint that we can all use. And you can get it for free from the link which is shown there. And it's one of a series of guides that I've been writing. The first one came out last year on biodiversity conservation, which is a huge topic and a huge concern. One on museums and disaster risk reduction, which I wrote it came out in August, which is to try to help museums to make decisions and slightly reshape through this awful COVID crisis and to try to help them, to be honest, make good decisions. And the last one is on museums and human rights, which will be out in December. And all of these things are related to one another. They're all concerned with museums and society and nature having a positive future. So they all are kind of interlinked. And again, you can get them from the links that are shown there. But just to do a very, very quick recap of what we spoke about last time is that sustainability is like, well, what is sustainability? Sustainability is the idea of a future state where the economy and society and the environment can develop together. So it's very different to the world that we have today, which is unfortunately in many ways getting worse. It's about trying to look at balancing the considerations of these three things. And the obvious one to start with would be prosperity. We might think that, well, prosperity, that means money. It doesn't necessarily mean money. It also means innovation, creativity, and enterprise, which we need absolutely, we desperately need at the moment to get through this COVID situation. And museums are obviously a very strong player in supporting innovation and creativity. People, so social capital, the idea of a future where people are all happy, where people are valued and can live together, whoever they are, and respecting difference, where different groups and different individuals are trusted, where we have the diversity of human existence and supported would be fantastic, and a just and fair and creative future. And finally, the ideas of planet, of natural capital, of wild places like this beautiful photograph of the Latvian countryside, lots of nature, biodiversity, nature species are protected, the environment is healthy, we have clean air and water, we get plenty of wild food from nature. Nature is basically functioning well and is stable. And so the way that I think about this is in terms of like if we think of a bank account where we have the capital, which is what we have invested, and the interest which accumulates each year. And so long as you just live off the interest, things can go on forever. And if we think about it in terms of three bank accounts, one to do with, we could call it social capital, economic capital, and natural capital. what we're trying to do is to grow all of these things for a better future. And so the best blueprint that we have available for this is it's called Agenda 2030, which is a document which you can see on the left-hand side there. And it includes a very fantastic vision of a sustainable future. And the way that that is to be achieved is through these 17 sustainable development goals, which are supported by 169 targets, which we'll talk a bit about. And so these goals were put together through a huge consultation exercise to say, well, you know, what are the things that if we solved these things, if we could do these things, would best help achieve that, that vision? So the Sustainable Development Goals aim to be a really, really practical tool, and particularly the targets, which I'll talk more about. And it's important to say that they're set out as an invitation to everyone and to all sectors to collaborate to common goals. And that's what we're here to do. And so, well, why should we use the Sustainable Development Goals? Why are they not just another thing when people already seem so busy? Well, let's think about how things tend to happen at the moment. Is that what tends to happen at the moment is there might be a crisis or a challenge, then there's a response to that, then we move on and nothing ultimately changes because we're only moving from problem to problem to problem. We're not actually changing anything, we're only responding to crises. So the Sustainable Development Goals aim to change that. They're saying that rather than thinking of problems as separate, they're all kind of related to one another. And we have to be careful that when we address one problem, we're not just creating a problem somewhere else, because that definitely tends to happen at the moment. And so what I would say is that if anyone is interested in sustainability in museums, the Sustainable Development Goals really are by a very, very long way the best tool around to help you to play your part. So because the Sustainable Development Goals are a global program, they apply everywhere to everyone. All governments everywhere have already acknowledged that they're important. They can provide people with meaningful activities, meaningful to the world's challenges and to their local situation. They can help museums put their unique resources to good use, whether that's their collections or their exhibitions or their buildings. And the next one is really important. It's like the Sustainable Development Goals can help museums to play a distinctive part in an ambitious global agenda, but to contribute to multiple agendas at the same time. So rather than thinking, oh, well, this year we'll do human rights, and oh, there's something going on about climate change, we'll do that. Oh, there's biodiversity is going quite badly, we'll do something about that. Or racism is quite bad, we'll do something about that. Of course, we have to do all of these things, but we also have to look at the connections between them. And so using the Sustainable Development Goals helps us to do all of these things at the same time. And so I'll talk in a bit about some of the main conventions, international agreements that there are around culture and heritage. To be honest, very few, if any, people have got the time to go through any of these or all of these. But to say they're already rolled into the Sustainable Development Goals. So they're actually a great shortcut to contributing to lots of the biggest challenges and the most important agendas that we all and problems that we all face. So because the Sustainable Development Goals apply to all sectors, they can help you, help us, help all of us to build partnerships and collaborations. And that's particularly true when it comes to looking at partnerships between different sectors, because if you can't find some kind of common language or common goal to work towards, the discussion is often not very productive. But if you can find partners and say, well, you know, we're all interested in affordable and clean energy, that gives you something, some common ground to work towards and to bring your own particular strengths and resources to. And lastly, because the Sustainable Development Goals are by a very long way the most ambitious program to set the world on a path to a sustainable future by 2030, the extent to which museums support that and help that be achieved is actually a great way for museums to demonstrate their value to society. And so in this webinar is based on, as I mentioned, on this guide that I wrote last year. And so it proposes 7 key activities that museums either do or they more or less do. And they're actually the main ways that we can support sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals. And so for this one, I'm going to focus largely on the first of the 7 activities around protecting and safeguarding cultural and natural heritage. And that doesn't just mean in museums, it means in the world more broadly. We'll touch a little bit on point 2 and point 3, but I'll talk more about them in the next webinar. So what is it? What is heritage? What is it? This thing that we're talking about, which often seems a bit difficult to grasp. Well, if heritage is whatever can be passed from one generation to another, so and it's also a little bit like people talk about Christmas. You can say that Christmas is more about the giving than the receiving, and we can say the same thing about heritage, rather than thinking of heritage primarily, looking backwards to what we get from the past. We can think about it in terms of what we give to the future. And so, of course, there are lots of different forms of heritage, which I'm sure you're aware of. It's a hugely broad topic, really. It might be buildings, it might be collections of buildings, it might be objects or information, which we're very familiar with in museums. It might be stories or ideas, and those might be stories or ideas that exist between all of us, or just within our family, or even just our own. Literature and language and music, performances and traditions, and also natural heritage, wild places, crops that we derive from nature, crafts and traditions, animals, plants and habitats, although it's very debatable whether we actually can say that we own them in order to pass them on. And we can actually think of climate as a global heritage, because it's something that we pass on to the future. And heritage is not necessarily a nice, always positive thing, because heritage can be used for very terrible purposes. Heritage can be sort of twisted to serve different political ends. It can help either bring people and groups together, but it can also drive them, it can also force them apart. And so also the way that we think about heritage is not necessarily material or objects. It's the way that we think about it and the values that we attach to it, all of which are plastic. They can change over time. I'm going to talk a bit about how all of these things relate to human rights. And you might think, well, what's this got to do with human rights? Well, in museums, we have to make decisions, and curating is about making decisions, as we'll come to talk about. But on what basis are we going to make our decisions? Are we just going to say, well, this is the way that we do these things, we're just going to do this? Or do we need to have a fairer kind of method for assessment? And I would say that human rights are actually a fantastic tool for this, that can be used in conjunction with the Sustainable Development Goals to guide our decisions. Because human rights are the rights that we all have, all of us, each of us, equally and everywhere. And they apply to everyone and can't be taken away, but they can help to guide public service, including museums, including the decisions that they make, whether that be curating or anything else. And although possibly not so many people realize it, that many human rights are very strongly related to museums and collections and exhibitions, which I'll show on the next slide. So these are just some rights which are established, they're established in international law, they're agreed, they're agreed globally, they apply to everyone. So I'll just take, in particular for museums, the first one is really important. Everyone has the right to take part in cultural life, which includes to access their own culture, take part in cultural activities, and to contribute to the cultural life of the community. Everyone has the right to benefit from scientific progress. Everyone has the right to information, and that might be information on collections, or it's information on topics that relate to their lives, the risks that they face, the place that they live in. Everyone has the right to education, and that doesn't just mean school education, it means lifelong learning. Everyone has the right to life, liberty and security of person. And everyone has the right to take part in environmental decision making. And I've included this last one here because it's obviously so relevant to climate change and to conserving biodiversity. And so all of these were established in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, apart from the last one, which is much more recent. But also to say that just as we all have rights, we all have duties, that we all have responsibilities, so that everyone also has duties to the community and to one another. And that again comes from the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. So I hope that you can see that these can actually be a really useful tool for us to think about as we're making our decisions about what to collect, what programs to do, what exhibitions to do, because they help us to think about, well, whose rights are being met and whose aren't, and what can we do about it? So again, like as with the Sustainable Development Goals, rights and the Sustainable Development Goals are really something that we can use that kind of helps sit kind of in the middle between museums, society, and the wider world. And just to give a few examples of how some of the more negative impacts that museums can have. So this is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it's much more recent, and it was adopted in 2007. And because it's a declaration rather than a convention, it doesn't have the same legal standing. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about how it relates to our work in museums. So that Indigenous peoples have the rights to maintain their cultural traditions and way of life, and they have the right to request property that was taken without their permission, and repatriation of human remains. And while possibly few museums may have been requested to return material, the last one is much more relevant to a very large number of museums, that Indigenous cultures have the right to be represented in a dignified way. And I think it's fair to say that that hasn't always happened. And this is just, as I say, to get across that we can all ask ourselves, well, how does our work support these aims? And how also are we contributing to some of the problems that we see? And so the main, there are 7 of the main international agreements that are to do with culture, cultural property, cultural heritage. They're called the cultural conventions. And it's fair to say they take a rather traditional approach to culture, especially the earlier ones around protecting copyright, protecting cultural property in the event of armed conflict, fighting against the illicit trafficking of cultural property, the World Heritage Convention from 1972, more recent convention on protecting underwater cultural heritage. And the last 2 are to do with intangible cultural heritage, to do with songs and performances and literature and traditions. And so we can see that there are these 7 conventions that really relate to the work of museums, but let's be honest, how many people have really read them or have the time, or even have the time to read them, because they can be quite large. They each have their own work program attached, so it's a bit like too much paperwork to actually deal with. And finally, I would add in that although museums and so on are very familiar with the cultural conventions, I think it's fair to say they're less familiar with the Rio Conventions, which came from the Earth Summit in 1992. And there are 3 of them: Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the predecessor of the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Convention to Combat Desertification. And if you're thinking, well, what have these got to do with museums? Well, the first 2, the Framework Convention on Climate Change and on Biological Diversity, they both have bits in them, sections in them, that are about the importance of public education and involvement and participation. So while the cultural sector has perhaps seen the cultural conventions more as its concern, these Rio Conventions are really, really important, and they're really important to recognise if we are to help support these agendas, the Paris Agreement and Convention on Biological Diversity. And I just thought I'd add in a quote here from Farida Shahid, who was the independent expert in cultural rights to the Human Rights Council, because this relates to what I was talking about before about, well, what is heritage and why is it important? And this is, I think, a very positive quote, that the concept of heritage reflects the dynamic character of something that's been developed, built or crafted, created, interpreted and reinterpreted in history, and transmitted from generation to generation. I think it's fair to say that most of us would think, well, that's a more or less like a standard approach to heritage. But the second one is more innovative, I think. That cultural heritage is also to be understood as resources enabling the cultural identification and development processes of individuals and communities, which they implicitly or explicitly wish to transmit to future generations. And what I take from that is that what she's saying is that heritage is really a kind of resource that helps us create the future that we want to see. It's not really about the past, it's about the future. And so what I would say is that, and this is where we'll come to the more practical part, is that collections can support all sustainable development challenges if we apply ourselves to them. For looking at the rights that we were looking at before, everyone has the right to take part in sustainable development activities. Everyone has the right to take part in making the world and their world a better place. Policy-related activities need the participation of people to be achieved. They will never happen if we don't help people find ways to take part in them. And museums and similar institutions give people these opportunities to attain their rights and to play a part in the world. And so we come to curating. Well, what is curating? Curating, comes from a very old word, to care for, but although I'm not so rooted in, well, what's the actual origin of the word? It's, well, what does it actually mean? What do we do? So curating to me is about three things. It's about attention to the real world, it's about careful selection, and it's about producing public value. So curators, we can't collect everything, and nor would we ever want to. So you collect things that relate to the challenges or the circumstances that we see. We put them together to create new combinations, and we use that as a kind of springboard for public engagement and for lots of different activities, research, and so on. And so we can really think of curating as a strategic activity that aims at maximizing public benefits through careful choices aimed at particular sustainability outcomes. And so what does it include? Well, as I say, even the definition of what a curator does or who they are varies very widely in different museums and different countries. But I would say curating includes looking after collections, developing collections, and let's be honest, that usually involves getting more material. It doesn't really often mean getting rid of material. Museums tend to be a kind of one-way journey. Curating includes helping people understand the relevance and significance of collections. It's about ensuring that collections-related information is accessible and available and in appropriate formats, because the object itself is only half of the story. You need the story itself to bring it to life. And that's unfortunately a link that is often broken. Curating includes contributing to exhibitions programs. That it might mean developing the exhibition, or it might mean providing material for it or writing text for exhibitions. And I would say it certainly involves working with partners and support and researching collections, whether that's research done by the curator themselves or supporting others to conduct research. And as a former curator myself, I'm very passionate about this, that curating collections and exhibitions is really a foundation of museum activities. And they really do help people to support and attain their rights and to take part in sustainable development challenges, or at least they can do. So, but we can think about these different activities that curators are involved in as almost as having different time lengths, different time frames in mind. Developing museums and collections is primarily for the long-term benefit. It's not necessarily just meaning something that's useful in the future, but now and in the future, but also in helping, I would say, in helping us bridge that gap between the present and the future. Developing galleries, which, let's face it, usually are in place for about 10 to 20 years, we could think of that as a kind of mid-term benefit. Activity that's useful now and can be useful in the mid-term, for this 20-year period. And developing temporary exhibitions is primarily for short-term benefits, and is, let's face it, often can be have economic benefits more in mind than the other two. And that's not to say at all that developing short temporary exhibitions should just be about delivery, about we do one event, it finishes, we move on to the next one, like a kind of production line, because each of those temporary exhibitions can also be steps on a journey to a more sustainable future. And so these are the questions that I think curators should be asking themselves in relation to human rights and the Sustainable Development Goals. So what place is it that our work relates to? Where is it that we make a difference in the world, or that we aim to? Is it very local? Is it global? Is it both? Is it national? And thinking in that context, well, whose rights are currently being met, and whose are not being met, and who is being left behind in society? So what are the challenges, social, environmental, and economic? And we can use the Sustainable Development Goals to help focus our minds on those. And we can think, well, looking outside at the challenges we see, well, what strengths does our collection or museum have for addressing these challenges? How can we apply what we have in the building to the situation we see outside? But also, what weaknesses does our collection and museum have? And are these weaknesses actually contributing to the situation we see beyond our walls? Also, as I mentioned before, with the Declaration on Indigenous rights, are museums causing any of the challenges, and what do you want to do about it? Are there any minorities in your communities, and how can their specific needs be met? Because minorities tend to be the people who are left farthest behind. What mechanisms can you use to connect people with their own heritage and the heritage of others? For instance, if you're in a museum with in an area with very strong traditions, are those traditions being supported, collected somehow, researched, and are you creating opportunities for people to participate in them? And also, it's that in our slightly challenging world, we also need to look at, well, how can we use our museums to help bring people from different groups together, particularly if they have very conflicting views, to explore challenges together, and rather than focusing on the challenges of the past, look at the shared future that we're all going to occupy. And that may draw on collections, and it may draw on events, it may draw on exhibitions. And so, as I mentioned, the Sustainable Development Goals are really, even if we look at them only from this very top level, for all of you to think about, well, what are the main challenges that in our context we face? If you're in a community that's in a place where the industry is declining, you might think, well, that relates very strongly to Goal 8 around decent work and economic growth. But you'll, I think, quickly realise that that relates to many of the others as well, notably around Goal 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities. And with decline in wealth, increasing conflict, that relates to goal 16 around peace, justice and strong institutions, and so on. And the only way that we can move forward from these challenges is by working together, and that supports goal 17, partnerships. Excuse me. So I'm just going to give a quick run through about how some of what we're talking about relates to the goals and targets. So I mentioned that we're talking about this key activity around strengthening efforts to protect and safeguard cultural and natural heritage. And that actually has a target of its own, which sits within the goal for sustainable cities and communities. You might think, oh, well, natural heritage, that's going to relate to goal 14, life below water, and goal 15, life on land, even just by looking at the little picture, the fish in the water and the birds around the tree. But actually heritage is involved much more broadly with the goals. I'll just run through these, because we're concerned with looking after heritage, which of course is impacted by disasters, natural and man-made and otherwise. And that relates to the one in the top left around disaster risk reduction is a process for managing reducing the risk of disasters and their impacts. Target 2.5 around maintaining genetic diversity in food production, if you look at the full title of the target, is actually around protecting and safeguarding local cultivated varieties, seeds, wild plants and animals that are their ancestors. And that will apply in all countries and clearly relates to museums, especially those with herbaria, where they keep dried plants or animals, preserved animals. Goal 13 is around climate change, strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity. So working to ensure that collections aren't lost to the impacts of climate change. That's what that means, 13.1. Reducing marine pollution, because we can think of heritage as not just the nice things that we pass on to the future, but also the not so nice things. So waste is also a form of heritage, although we tend not to think about it that way. But museums, they consume lots of energy, they produce lots of waste. This is an example of how they can support natural heritage by reducing their own waste. Working because we're not just in the business of making sure things don't get any worse, we're trying to make the future better than the present. So that involves restoring ecosystems. Restoring ecosystems involves people knowing what they can do, how they can do things, having opportunities to do it. And would say that museums can help with all of these things. And the same with target 15.1 around conserving and restoring life on land. Protecting biodiversity and natural habitats relates to museums, of course, because especially natural history museums with collections that can support research and public exhibitions and events. The next two are very relevant to museums in terms of how they make sure that both they don't receive objects that might have come from an illegal wildlife trade. They might be from ivory or rhino horn or rare butterflies or shells or insects. But it's also very important to recognize that museums can contribute to those illegal markets when they're a source of material. So the most obvious example is where lots of museums had their rhino horns stolen over the last kind of 10 years. And they were being stolen from museums, and they were being sold on the illegal markets. So working to ensure that that museums' own collections are well protected and safeguarded from thieves helps to ensure that they don't contribute to this illegal market. And the last one, although it's not so clear from the icon or even from the description. So target 16.4 is around making sure that anything that was acquired illegally is returned to its rightful owners. And so we could say that that relates to repatriation requests, where material can be shown to have been acquired, taken without people's consent or against their will. We could say that that relates to that target there. And so again, we return to the Sustainable Development Goals that the challenges that each of you face and the opportunities that each of you present will be really different depending on your context, the collections that you have, the problems that there are, the aspirations that your communities have, and then we're trying to put these things together. And I'll give some examples. So Inga and Zani gave me some images relating to Latvian heritage and museums. And so we can think about this dark heritage or black archaeology. It's a crime. And just to show how just one activity can relate to many goals and targets, and that's actually one of the really interesting things about them, is that illegal markets and heritage, they threaten the world's cultural and natural heritage. So they relate to Target 11.4. By combating that and trying to return material to where it should be, contributes to Target 16.4, which I mentioned on the last slide. But all of that is worth doing because it's about ensuring that we have a kind of peaceful and just, a society based on justice, which supports Target 16.3. Working between different partners, so ensuring that museums' policies help safeguard them from these illegal markets. So for instance, collection management and accessioning, you would normally have a process of kind of due diligence, we would call it, where you're trying to ascertain that whoever gave you the collection, it was rightfully theirs. That supports Target 17.14. Working effectively with different sectors, for instance, the police or criminal investigations, supports 17.17. But fundamentally, the way to address this problem is through education. So education could come right at the start of that list, but I've put it at the end to say, well, one of the ways that we help ensure that people aren't going stealing heritage or selling it around is by developing their understanding that it's not actually theirs, it's everyone's. And that clearly is something that all museums can be doing, is instilling to help people to value and understand heritage as a shared thing that we all have. Nobody owns it, it belongs to all of us. Or if we take the Museum of the Occupation in the KGB building, so what can we say about this? We have a building with a rather difficult history that's been repurposed as an educational place, as a museum. And so we can use that to help promote universal inclusion, that we can bring different groups together, people from different communities, to explore not just the past and how the society came to be the way it is, but to explore what kind of society they want to be moving forward, contributing to Goal 11 on sustainable cities and communities. I would say that the content, the subject matter relates to some of these targets in Goal 16 around peace, justice and strong institutions, around reducing violence, including violence by the state against society, against the population. And I would say very importantly is around 1610, is around ensuring public access to information. And this line here about protecting fundamental freedoms means making sure that people's human rights are being met. So surveillance by the state, interference by the state in people's personal lives is kind of not okay. And clearly this museum can be a great place for exploring that. And again, that contributes to this target around education for sustainable development, which means how we all live together, how we all are involved in creating a future that we all want to see and to live in. The Zanis, sorry, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, so excuse me. So the Zanis Lipkin Memorial, a very, very amazing man who saw the terrible treatment of particular groups of people just because of who they are. So again, that relates very much to promoting universal social inclusion, making sure that minorities aren't treated in a bad way, or even in a, that they are harmed. And again, this is a basis of sustainable cities and communities, peace and justice. And again, I've got the same targets here around we can use these historical lessons to kind of shine a light on the abuses that we see either in our own place or globally, and to think about, well, is that the world that we want to live in? Hopefully not. So what are we going to do about it? What can we together do about it? I thought I'd give an example to do with natural heritage. So this is from the Latvian Natural History Museum, an exhibition about woods and rivers. And nature is hugely important to us. And of course, it needs to exist in its own right. Provides us with clean water, helps address climate change, and of course is the home to lots of wildlife. So, excuse me just a second. So what are we going to do? What does this exhibition help us explore? It might help us explore, well, how can we conserve and restore nature? How can we protect habitats? And we do this again through education, and that helps us to promote a universal understanding of how people can live in harmony with nature. And so we'll just take the example of the beaver. Formerly very extensively hunted animal, certainly became extinct in Britain, became extinct in lots of parts of Europe. Not good for nature, but also not good for people, because beavers help manage habitats, they create habitats. So helping to shift these attitudes that nature is something to be controlled or exploited to something that we need to live with is a basis for sustainable development, and something that exhibitions can certainly help to do. An example from the Open Air Museum. So very fantastic. I take it as a church made of wood. So I guess not a single piece of plastic, not a single piece of concrete, which has a terribly high carbon footprint. So we can use places like this to explore the sustainability of buildings and materials in the past. But I take it from the top right-hand picture that this is when it was flooded. So also an example of how heritage is threatened by things like we see like climate change, with more extreme weather, with flooding. And so we can use these kind of places again as a kind of inspiration for climate action, promoting universal understanding of sustainable lifestyles, but also looking at, well, what do we need to do to protect the world's cultural and natural heritage in the face of climate change and other disasters? And we can do all these things through education. So this is my closing kind of idea. The collections, exhibitions, events and museums are really, really essential for supporting people, whether that's as individuals, in groups, in communities, and all of us, to achieve their own potential, our own potential, to live together, to enjoy a rich and fulfilling life, and to understand and care for one another and our environment. But protecting collections and museums protects human rights. Thank you.